You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest today. I want to welcome back to the Final Say Radio Show. We have Phil Kerpen, who's the president of American Commitment. Phil, it's great to have you back on here, and also I congratulate you on continuing this story, the Obama's war on coal, because it seems that not enough people are willing to challenge, not just his policy, but his thoughts and his continuation of something he's been really working on for years.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, I spent a lot of time and effort last year telling everyone about the costs of this administration's war on coal and other anti-energy policies, and was very active in states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio on this issue. And, of course, the president and all of his supporters denied it. They denied what was obvious right in front of our faces. They said there is no war on coal. They said it's a myth. The Nation magazine ran a headline saying the war on coal is a myth, and it was all about how people like me were lying. And then Obama does get reelected, carries all of these coal states, in part by lying about what I thought was obvious. And then, he announces this big global warming plan last week, and his political consultant, David Plouffe, goes on Twitter and says, this is why elections matter. And I'm like shaking my head because you lied to everyone to get them to vote for you in all these areas. And then once you win, of course, you go back to what we knew you wanted to do all along and act like that's what the people voted for. And now we've got this new presidential memorandum was issued today instructing the EPA to move forward on all these regulations, which, of course, they wanted to do anyway. And so, this is going to happen. What we warned about is going to happen with major implications for the U.S. economy.
No, absolutely. In fact, you covered it in your book as well. But, Phil, what really gets me on this particular issue, and even what you wrote here, and you're absolutely right, is that these states, these swing states, that almost all of them swung for his reelection, stand to lose. These particular states could lose hundreds of thousands of jobs alone. It's going to have a significant impact on these state economies, and they still didn't see it, and they still may not even understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, how people will hear what they want to hear, even when all the facts are right in front of their eyes. And, this campaign was brilliant at telling people what they wanted to hear. And, this president actually won the energy issue. He beat Mitt Romney on energy. People trusted Obama more, even though the same time he was saying all of the above, all of the above, all of the above, he was pursuing all these regulations, getting everything teed up to essentially destroy coal and, in various ways inhibit other fossil fuels, the things that are actually economically competitive.
And now you put a statistic in here that it just says it all. That if the United States, if we go to these standards that Obama's pushing for, and we go to zero emissions in the U.S., immediately that would only reduce the global average temperatures 0.08 degrees Celsius by 2050. And that says it all. It's like a complete waste of our time, abuse of our economy, abuse of the American worker.
Yeah, and actually, those numbers came from an analysis that Chip Knappenberger from Cato did recently, and what he modeled was he didn't just model these new regulations that Obama wants. He said, what if we shut down the entire U.S. economy completely? You had zero emissions of any greenhouse gases from anywhere in the United States. What would the impact of that be on global climate using the conventional models that the UN IPCC uses? So using the most extreme models that we're always told are the consensus, everything like that. He said, what if the U.S. went to zero, shut down the entire U.S. economy? And he found that number that you just used, 0.08 degrees is the difference you get out of that model in the year 2050. And he also found that the rest of the world would make up for the entire U.S. economy being shut down in just 7 years. And so you're right. There's zero environmental benefit to these policies that Obama's proposing, which, of course, don't take us to zero emissions, and so they would be less than, that amount of averted global warming if you believe all the computer models. And, for that, Heritage has recently estimated it's going to cost $1,400 for an average household for these regulations, and I think it could end up being a lot more than that. I think they use very conservative assumptions in that estimate. So we're being asked to pay $1,400 or perhaps considerably more for nothing, for a feel-good feeling. Hey, we did something. It made no difference, but hey, we did something. And that's basically what's at stake with these regulations.
Yeah, exactly. When you add that to the extra price at the pump we've been paying for the last 4 or 5 years now, it's more significant on the poor and middle class than it is for anyone else. And you add it up. If you drive enough, it's a couple thousand for your gas. It's a few thousand a year for your electric and your natural gas and all your other home heating bills. And that for somebody only making $30,000-$40,000 a year, it's a significant amount. Of course, this is after-tax dollars you're talking about. And I just don't understand how this administration or people who have this line of thinking can go out there and sell to these people that, hey, we're doing something that's good for you. I mean, it's hurting us in the pocketbook directly. And it just amazes me how we just don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with that. And, it's interesting because Obama, of course, in his usual style, this is not a bill that he's proposing to send up to Congress. He's just saying, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm issuing this presidential memorandum instructing the EPA to move forward with all these policies. That was actually published today, by the way, this presidential memorandum. It's a pretty interesting document. If you want to take a look at it, it's published in the Federal Register. But, there is going to be a vote that is very relevant to this in the U.S. Senate, and that's the confirmation vote for Gina McCarthy, who's Obama's pick to run the EPA. She's currently running the Air and Radiation Office in the EPA, so she's been working on all these rules already, and he wants to reward her with a promotion to the top job. And, I think this is going to be the key test vote for voters to find out where their senators stand on this whole agenda and what Obama's trying to do, because Gina McCarthy has been kind of his key ally throughout this. And in fact, she publicly lied about what these regulations were going to do at a very key moment a couple of years ago. We had a vote a few years ago in June of 2010 on a resolution that Lisa Murkowski from Alaska put in that would have overturned what's called the endangerment finding, which was the predicate for all these greenhouse gas regulations out of EPA. It needed 51 votes to pass. It failed by 4 votes. It got 47 votes, and it failed in part because Gina McCarthy was out there reassuring all the coal state Democrats, we will not mandate fuel switching. We will not issue regulations forcing coal plants to switch to natural gas. And I think that reassurance made it easier for all the coal state Democrats to vote against that resolution, prevented it from passing. And, of course, now we know that it's false. Obama came out and directly said that he does want to require fuel switching, and these regulations will require fuel switching. And now he wants to reward Gina McCarthy basically for lying on his behalf when it really mattered, with the top job at EPA. So I think this is the kind of vote where people really need to get engaged, tell their senators to vote no on Gina McCarthy, and try to send a message back to this White House that people shouldn't be promoted for that kind of behavior.
Phil, the sad irony here is that energy, and whether we're talking about coal or fracking and other ways that America can extract greater mineral resources, this is one of the few things, if not the only thing, that we appear to have on our corner that could turn the tide on America's financial demise. And we have here the opportunity for coal to have to clean its act up. And let's just say that coal has things that it could do. Maybe it can continue scrubbing more. Maybe it can do some carbon capture and other technologies that they've been working on. But at a time when coal is actually under competitive pressure from gasoline, while at the same time the thirst for energy continues to grow worldwide, the industry, like many other industries, normally will have to clean itself up because it's competing. It's competing against gas, which is cheaper right now and which is perceived or in reality is greener. And instead of allowing it to compete and maybe watching it and helping guide it, the idea of basically coming in with the president's new policy of shovel ready, meaning bring the shovel in line because we're going to kill an industry, I just don't get it. It's extremely frustrating, and it makes you wonder what his ultimate agenda is, maybe having nothing to do with actually trying to save the world from global warming.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really good point. The fracking boom has produced so much cheap natural gas in this country that there is tremendous market pressure, even independent of all these regulations. And for the most part, if you're building a new a new power plant right now, you're going to build a natural gas plant because a combined cycle natural gas plant is very high efficiency with cheap natural gas prices. It makes more sense from an investment standpoint than a coal plant. Now, that said, you've got still, when Obama came in, there were 600 coal plants in the U.S. I think it's down to about 400 now through the policies they've already implemented. That's an awful lot of plants that cost an awful lot of money, hundreds of millions, in some cases billions of dollars. And when you say we're going to put a regulation in that biases the business calculation, so you retire that plant, decades ahead of the end of its useful life, then ratepayers have to pay the capital cost for that plant plus whatever it gets replaced with, and then it doesn't make economic sense. Whereas if you left it to the market to decide, maybe natural gas stays cheap for a long time, and maybe coal continues to lose market share, or maybe something else happens. We start using natural gas in transportation or something else, and market forces work it out. But when you decide government's going to make that decision instead of letting the market work it out, you end up imposing huge costs on ratepayers because we've got to pay for all those plants that were just made obsolete decades ahead of time. And in this case, there's also kind of this amazing fact that they just put very expensive mercury rules in place last year, and so you got a lot of power plants, and in some places have had these at the state level already, but you've got a lot of power plants that just spent hundreds of millions of dollars upgrading their pollution control technology for mercury, adding scrubbers and so forth. Now when the greenhouse gas rules go final, they're going to be told use carbon capture and storage, which doesn't exist commercially, or shut down and convert to natural gas. And so, even the pollution control investments of the past couple of years are going to be totally wasted if these regulations move forward.
I think one of the biggest problems with his agenda here is the fact that when you're essentially he's calling for the end of fossil fuels. And if you're doing that, then you can't call for or make such a case unless you've already started building new nuclear power plants or we're underway or far enough along in technology and solar and wind or other alternatives that could replace it and affordable. Because your alternative can't be 3 and 4 times the price, or you're going to destroy the economy. And right now, if you were to take away all the fossil fuel type sources and replace them with just solar and wind, you'd have to cover the whole country with it, and you probably still couldn't produce enough energy that we use. I mean, it's like it doesn't even make sense what they're trying to accomplish here at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually not too far off of already reaching the maximum wind power capacity of the U.S. because there are only so many spots that work, and then you've got the intermittency issues that the wind doesn't always blow, and so you need to have that backup power, and that's usually natural gas peaking units that are much less efficient than the combined cycle natural gas plants. So you have a situation where if you build wind and gas to back it up, you end up spending more and getting less out of it than if you just built natural gas. And so how does that make sense? And I think really, all of these anti-coal regulations depend, from an economic standpoint, to make any sense at all, they depend on natural gas really being the alternative, the only alternative. But then at the same time, you got all these green groups out trying to shut down natural gas production with their fractivism, and you got the Sierra Club, which led the whole anti-coal charge with their Beyond Coal campaign. Now they're out there with their sequel called Beyond Natural Gas, and they're saying they're going to sue on every natural gas plant that's proposed from now on. And just to show you how mixed up these people are, I just saw an article today that there's an anti-fracking environmental group in western New York that is protesting against a coal plant switching to natural gas, which is what all these Obama regulations are trying to make happen. They're protesting against a coal plant switching to natural gas because they're against fracking. So these people can't even get their story straight.
Well, I don't think it's about actually getting their story straight. I think you know exactly what this is about. It's about dishonesty. They want to destroy all forms of fossil fuels, which would be fine if we had a viable, reasonable alternative that could be applied quickly and that didn't have other secondary effects. I mean, look, the wind farms are devastating many bird species that almost defies common sense. We wouldn't thought the birds would be flocking into blenders, so to speak, but that's what's happening. And Phil, what drives me crazy here is we need a balance of markets. We need competition, because what happens if we have it could be some catastrophic event, that an earthquake or something that somehow, or a terrorist event that shuts down major gas mains. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and just a couple of years ago, you may recall, we did have one of our major gas underground pipes feeding up from, I believe, Texas or Louisiana, that caused a significant problem in gas here and impacted every single industry. And if we try to move to a single industry mentality, we're more susceptible to every reason why failure can be catastrophic. And, to have two or more major economic powerhouses, pun intended, I think is very, very important for sustaining an economy that is basically fueled by energy.
Well, look, I think that's basically correct, and I think that you get a certain diversification, if you allow the market to function. And one of the problems with government regulations that force particular technologies is not only do you get less diversification than you might see in a marketplace, but you get diversification in a way that doesn't make sense, that actually compounds potential failures, because you've got technologies that aren't necessarily resilient or economical. They get built only because of government subsidies or mandates, and then as taxpayers, we're kind of on the hook to keep them going forever, or we get accused of wanting all those people to lose their jobs and so on. And so you really can sort of get trapped that way, and trapped into technologies that may not have been the best path. I do think there's a role for government in energy innovation, but it's doing very basic research type stuff. And ARPA-E, which is one of the things this administration has done inside the Department of Energy, I think is a pretty good program in that regard. You do basic research of the type that doesn't have any commercial application, just to see what's possible, what can happen. You have the national labs for that, universities and so on. But if anything promising comes out of that, someone in the private sector is going to pick it up and run with it, because there's money to be made there. And so I think where we really get into trouble with government policy is when we try to subsidize mature technologies, like wind generating electric turbines that have been around for 125 years. It was invented by Charles Brush in Cleveland, Ohio, 125 years ago. There are inherent limitations there that no amount of throwing taxpayer money at it is going to overcome. So instead of subsidizing mature technologies that don't make economic sense to this huge tune, we should really, I think, as taxpayers through the government, be focused on just basic research, the types of things that don't have commercial applications, just sort of, running that stuff down. And if it has promise, it'll reach the point that someone will pick it up in the private sector.
Phil, there's a whole other interesting area here to ponder, which is if we look at all power plants, especially baseload power plants, which could be hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars to invest in, and these things have a long depreciation cycle. If you look at large-scale other infrastructure in renewables, these things also have large infrastructure costs and at minimum entail significant infrastructure to bring in the transmission lines to deliver that power. As you mentioned, it's a very intermittent technology, so you need to be able to deliver alternative power. So the whole challenge here is if we have to worry about who's sitting in a government office in any one particular biannual or quadrennial cycle, to worry about something that could be 20 to 30-year depreciations for investment, aren't we doing a huge disservice to either driving investment away from the markets, energy markets in general, as well as to drive up the cost of the investments they do make, which of course means ultimately our cost increase across the board for energy?
Yeah, I think you are. And what happens, and I think what is happening, is you've got to build this huge sort of political risk, political cost factor into any investment before you can make it. I mean, you got to kind of assess whether you can kind of weather the regulatory storm, and that's become kind of the principal question for a lot of these energy investments. Is not, does this make sense as an investment in terms of the return on investment in a market sense, but will I be allowed to operate this over the productive life of the asset? Or will government come in and stop me or impose, some very expensive costs? And I think that's one of the major factors why nobody wants to build new coal plants. It's not just that natural gas is so cheap right now, because if you looked over long planning horizons, you might not be as concerned with the current spot price of the fuel in the total cost. But you kind of look at all this stuff in the regulatory pipeline. Nobody wants to take on that risk, and that has a major impact on taxpayers and on ratepayers.
Yeah, that's a great point. Phil, are there any with all the talk about immigration reform and some of the other things going on in Washington, are there any senators or key people that are still focused on this coal issue?
Well, I think the key question that we've got coming up is this nomination of Gina McCarthy, and I'm very concerned that a few Republicans have indicated they're going to vote for her, in particular Susan Collins from Maine and Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire, which I think is completely crazy. I don't know if you guys are on in New Hampshire at all, but they just spent $500 million upgrading their big coal plant in Merrimack Station, and now she's going to vote for the nomination of someone whose job is to shut it down and shut down all the other coal plants and just waste the $500 million that her constituents just spent. I think that's crazy. And so I think those two very important to get some pressure. And, all the coal state Democrats, this should be a key political test vote for them. Do they really want to vote for somebody whose job is going to be to implement this agenda?
Well, that is the Northeast you're talking about with Kelly Ayotte, so...
I think she's kind of fallen in with the wrong crowd in the Senate. She's like palling around with Lindsey Graham and John McCain all the time.
Unfortunately. Yeah, I saw some of the immigration votes definitely prove that one. Anyway, Phil, it's great to have you, and thank you so much again. Keep up the great work. And what's the website for American Commitment? It's
AmericanCommitment.org.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Phil. It's Phil Kerpen,
President of
American Commitment. Take care. Bye.